Hey cadets, today we continue on with our first aid class and first aid emergencies. You all should have completed yesterday by reading the gather information and take action and call for help. In there you should have learned about your 7 life-saving steps of 1, checking if the person's conscious. 2, checking for breathing or a heartbeat. Third thing you're going to do is check for bleeding. And then the 4th thing would be checking for shock. 5th thing is check for fractures. The 6th thing would be to check for burns. And then the last thing would be to check for any head injuries. If you go through those life-saving steps, those are the most critical processes that you need to go through in order to provide assistance to someone. Okay, you should have also created a flow map on the 4 guidelines for first aid. You didn't have to do that, but you all should know that that whole process of how we go through is you need to be recognizing the signs of an emergency. And then the next step would be to remove any immediate dangers in order to protect yourself. And then after that, you would gather the information and take action, which is from your readings yesterday. That's where you would be gathering the information, take those 7 steps. And then if needed, call for help if needed. And those are your 4 steps that you would take. And you should understand that. Prepare for an emergency situation. You should understand that those are the steps we go through in order to make sure we can provide proper first aid in an emergency. Okay, when checking an injured person, the first thing you should find out is if the person is breathing, in shock, bleeding, or conscious. And from your reading yesterday, the first thing you're going to do is check to see if they're conscious. They might have their eyes closed, going up to them, say, hey, are you awake? Are you conscious? They might open their eyes. But that's the first thing you do. To find out if an unconscious person has a pulse, you should put your ear on their chest and listen for a heartbeat, feel for a pulse at the person's wrist, or feel for a pulse at the person's neck. And the best way to get the pulse is at the neck. Feel for the pulse at the person's neck. You're playing basketball with some of your friends when one of them takes a bad fall. When you check him, you notice that his foot is not pointed straight. You should not straighten his foot immediately, keep him still until help arrives, or ask him to help and get back in the game. I think this one's pretty obvious. We saw the football injury the other day. Straighten his foot immediately would be a bad idea because it's probably dislocated and you'd be doing more damage. You're babysitting your 2-year-old brother who is sick. He's been throwing up for the last 4 hours and can't even keep down water. You can't reach your parents. You aren't sure if this is an emergency. You should wait and see if he gets better, give some crackers and milk to settle his stomach, call 911 or urgent care center for help. And I think you would understand for that long, you would need to call 911 to get some help or an urgent care center. Gathering information about an injured person may help you decide what kind of first aid is needed. Even if you're unable to provide first aid, this information is vital for getting supplies you need from a first aid kit, providing information to an emergency operator, or contacting the injured person's family. And that was from your reading yesterday about call for help if needed, and that is to provide information to the emergency operator. Okay, using what you learned to respond to an emergency situation, how would you do that? That's the main thing we want to get you thinking. How am I going to respond? Okay, we're not going to do this scenario. In class, you go through some first aid scenarios, but instead I'm going to direct you to a Cadet Command website that's going to run you through some scenarios and you have to answer the questions. And we'll cover that in the live portion of class. So, what is the most important thing you learned about first aid emergencies? Hopefully you learn, that you need to be prepared, and you should know where first aid kits are, and that there's a process that you should go through anytime you come across an emergency situation. The more you think about it and the better you're prepared, the more likely you're going to be able to provide the good first aid that someone needs to potentially save their life. So how do you think you'd respond in real life to an emergency? And you really don't know how it would be until you're actually in a scenario. Like I said, but the more you think about and prepare for it, the more you might be prepared and not panic as much. And the idea is to try to remain calm. And what emergencies do you think you're most likely to encounter in everyday life? I know that it depends. Like I said, you will come across them. I told one of my classes, I didn't realize it, but yesterday, my son going to school actually witnessed a major car wreck in which the person, we don't know if she survived or not. We're going to be watching the news. So he actually was just yesterday in that sort of scenario. Okay, think about how you can remember the 7 life-saving steps. That'd be a good thing to do. Maybe an acronym of some sort, but that would be something you should really understand, the process of what we check in order to make sure we're providing good first aid. Checking if they're conscious, then understanding that breathing and heartbeat are the next critical things, and then go to bleeding. Because, if they're not breathing or have a heartbeat, it doesn't matter how much they're bleeding, you're not going to be able to save them. You got to get them back to breathing or having some sort of heartbeat. And then you can treat for those other, bleeding and then shock or fractures and everything else. But you need to go through the proper steps. Okay, we won't be doing that. We'll go through some of the questions to wrap things up. That'll be on the quiz. An injured person who is blank is awake and aware of what's going on. Is that in shock, paralyzed, or conscious? The answer to that is conscious. That is a person who's awake and aware. Disposable gloves are precautions used to protect first aid providers from blank bodily fluids. Is that persistent, contaminated, or messy? And we said that about universal precautions, contaminated bodily fluids. First aid is the blank care given to a victim of injury or sudden illness before professional medical help arrives. It's a persistent, temporary, immediate, amateur, and that's in your inspection questions. You also know that it's the immediate care that's given. A broken bone is often called paralysis, fracture, or crack. I think it's obvious on that one, it's a fracture. Blank are laws protecting volunteers from lawsuits if medical complications arise after they administered first aid. Helpful Samaritan laws, good rescuer laws, or good Samaritan laws. And we talked about that in our classes, and that's the good Samaritan laws. Protects you if you take action and they can't come after you and sue you because you were trying in good faith to help them out. When giving first aid to someone with potential broken bone, you should blank the injured part or keep it from moving. Is that immobilize, traction, or paralyze? And the answer to that is, you should immobilize it. Blank is the inability to move, often caused by serious neck or back injuries. It's pretty obvious, I think. Persistency, paralysis, shock, or unconsciousness. And then obviously that is paralysis. Persistent means rarely occurring, the action of stomach muscles when vomiting, repeated or constant, twitching uncontrollably, and persistent is repeated or constant. And when we say if they have persistent pain or persistent, that is an emergency situation. Blank is a serious condition in which a person's organs aren't getting enough blood or oxygen, and that was in our readings also, and that is the definition of what shock is. Their organs aren't getting enough because they're in shock, and it starts affecting them, and you need to provide care. Blank are actions taken to prevent the spread of disease. Is that universal precautions? unified precautions, personal precautions, or universal cautions. And we talked about that in our presentation yesterday, and that's the universal precautions. All right, so that completes all the questions. Back to our central question: how can you determine the need for first aid in an emergency? And that's the big thing we wanted to cover, is that you decide how you're going to respond in an emergency situation. And you never know when it's going to occur. It could happen to your family. It could happen like it happened to my son yesterday, car accident right in front of him. In a major car accident, bleeding, people unconscious. How would you respond to that? He had to respond. So that completes the presentation. I will tell you that in It's Learning, I'm going to direct you to a new website, and it's going to be this JRTC Smart Cadet. You will use your email your school email to log in, and I'll have the information about the passwords and everything else. And you will go through and do some scenarios, and I will cover that in class tomorrow, telling you what to do. But you'll go in there and it'll ask you questions, and you'll do those scenarios. It's pretty interesting. So that is what we've got on task for today. Hopefully you have learned something about the emergency situations, and we will stop the presentation.